Page 2, para. All the critical approaches described in this book are a reaction against something which went before, and a prior knowledge of these things cannot be assumed. Hence, I start with an account of the liberal humanism within quote, against which all these newer critical approaches, broadly speaking, define themselves. Stop. Likewise, the currently successful versions of Marxist, feminist, psychoanalytic and linguistic criticism all define themselves against earlier versions of each of these, and therefore I try in each case to explain the earlier versions first. I think that many of the current difficulties students have with theory arise from trying to miss out this stage. My approach amounts to throwing you in at the shallow end. Potentially, this is more painful than being thrown in at the deep end, the technique used in most other student introductions to literary theory, but it does reduce the risk of drowning. Para. It should perhaps be stressed that the other general introductions to theory that are now available are different from this one. They offer an even and comprehensive coverage of the entire field, but with relatively little in the way of practical discussion of applications. I find them very useful, but they seem to me to be recapitulations of literary theory, often from a viewpoint more philosophical than literary, rather than introductions to it. The evenness of the coverage means that the pace never varies, so that there is no opportunity to stop and dwell upon an example in a reflective way. By contrast, I haven't tried to be comprehensive, and I do try to provide variation in pace by selecting questions or examples or key essays for closer treatment. Generally, the available introductions don't grapple with the problems of teaching or learning theory. Until recently, the only two that tried to do so were Durant, D-U-R-A-N-T, and Fabb's, F-A-B-B'-S, Literary Studies in Action, and Lynn's, L-Y-N-N'-S, Texts and Contexts, bracket, see further reading section, bracket close, stop. Page 3. Both these are interesting but eccentric books whose rather fragmented format prevents any real flow of discussion or explanation. Para. At undergraduate level, the main problem is to decide how much theory can reasonably be handled by beginners. Time is not unlimited, and there is a need to think about a realistic syllabus rather than an ideal one. Theorists, like novelists, are dauntingly plentiful, and the subject of theory cannot succeed in lecture rooms and seminars unless we fashion it into a student-centered syllabus. We are rightly dismissive these days of the notion of teaching a, quote, great tradition, unquote, of key novelists as advocated by the critic F.R. Leavis, L-E-A-V-I-S. But Leavis's great tradition was essentially a syllabus manageable within a year-long undergraduate course on the novel. It is possible to read and adequately discuss a novel or two by Austen, Eliot, James, Conrad, and Lawrence within that time. We need to make sure that what is presented as theory today likewise makes teaching sense. Para. When we are about to move into something new, it is sensible to first take stock of what we already have, if only so that the distance travelled can later be measured. So in the first chapter of this book, I invite you to look back critically and reflectively on your previous training in literary studies. We then go on to look at the assumptions behind traditional literary criticism, or, quote, liberal humanism, unquote, as theorists usually call it. Para. The term liberal humanism became current in the 1970s as a shorthand within bracket and mainly hostile way of referring to the kind of criticism which held sway before theory. The word liberal in this formulation roughly means not politically radical and hence generally evasive and non-committal on political issues. Humanism implies something similar. It suggests a range of negative attributes such as non-Marxist and non-feminist and non-theoretical. There is also the implication that liberal humanists believe in, quote, human nature, unquote, as something fixed and constant which great literature expresses. Liberal humanists did not, bracket, and do not, comma, as a rule, bracket closed, use this name of themselves, but says an influential school of thought, if you practice literary criticism and do not call yourself a Marxist critic, or a structuralist, or a stylistician, or some such, then you are probably a liberal humanist, whether or not you admit or recognize this. Para. In the course of explaining some of the major critical ideas now current, this book provides summaries or descriptions of a number of, page 4, important theoretical essays. But I want to stress at the outset that it is important too that you read some of the major theories at first hand. Yet, as soon as you begin to turn the pages of Barthes, B-A-R-T-H-E-S, Lacan, Foucault, or Derrida, D-E-R-R-I-D-A, you will encounter writing which looks dauntingly difficult and off-putting. How then to cope? Para. I suggest that it is much better to read intensely in theory than to read widely. By this I mean that you will gain little from reading chapter after chapter of a book that is making little sense to you. You will gain much more by using the same amount of reading time to read one crucial and frequently mentioned chapter or article several times for yourself. Having a detailed knowledge of what is actually said in the pages of a well-known argument, being aware of how the argument unfolds and how it is qualified or contextualized, will be far more useful to you than a superficial overall impression gained from commentaries or from desperate skim reading. However daunting the material, you have to make your reading meditative, reflective and personal. Try to become a slow reader. Further, some intensive reading of this kind will enable you to quote lines other than the handful that are cited in all the commentaries. And most importantly, your view of things will be your own, perhaps quirky, Q-U-I-R-K-Y, and incomplete, but at least not just the echo and residue of some published commentator's pre-packed version. In a nutshell, intensive reading is often more useful than extensive reading. Quote, English studies, unquote, is founded on the notion of close reading, and while there was a period in the late 1970s and early 1980s when this idea was frequently disparaged, it is undoubtedly true that nothing of any interest can happen in this subject without close reading. Para. I suggest therefore that you try out for yourself a useful form of intensive reading, the technique known as SQ3R, within quote SQ3R. This breaks down the reading of a difficult chapter or article into 5 stages as designated by the letters SQRRR or SQ3R as it is usually given. The 5 stages are para S, that is survey the whole chapter or section fairly rapidly, skimming through it to get a rough sense of the scope and nature of the argument. Remember that information is not evenly spread throughout a text. It tends to be concentrated in the opening and closing paragraphs where you often get useful summaries of the whole, and the hinge points of the page 5 argument are often indicated in the opening and closing sentences of paragraphs. Para Q. Having skimmed the whole, set yourself some questions, some things you hope to find out from what you are reading. This makes you an active reader rather than a passive one and gives you your reading a purpose. Para. R1. Now read the whole piece. Use a pencil if the copy is your own to underline key points, query difficulties, circle phrases worth remembering, and so on. Don't just sit in front of the pages. If the book is not your own, jot something down on paper as you read, however minimal. R2. Para. Now close the book and recall what you have read. Jot down some summary points. Ask whether your starting questions have been answered or at least clarified. Spell out some of the difficulties that remain. In this way, you record some concrete outcomes to your reading so that your time doesn't simply evaporate uselessly once the book is closed. Para R3. This final stage is the review. It happens after an interval has elapsed since the reading. You can experiment, but initially try doing it the following day. Without opening the book again or referring back to your notes, review what you have gained from the reading. Remind yourself of the question you set yourself, the points you jotted down at the recall stage, and any important phrases from the essay. If this produces very little, then refer back to your notes. If they make little sense, then repeat the survey stage and do an accelerated read by reading the first and the last paragraphs of the essay and skim reading the main body assisted by your penciled markings. Para. You may well have evolved a study technique something like this already. It is really just common sense, but it will help you to ensure that you gain something from a theoretical text, no matter how initially forbidding it might be. Para. Finally, it will, I hope, go without saying that no comprehensiveness is possible in a format such as this. Clearly also, this book does not contain all you need to know about theory, and it does not in itself, bracket, without the reading it refers you to, bracket closed, constitute a course in literary theory. It leaves out a good deal, and it deals fairly briskly, page 6, with many topics. It is a starter pack intended to give you a sense of what theory is all about and suggest how it might affect your literary studies. Above all, it aims to interest you in theory. Para. Approaching theory. If you are coming to literary theory soon after taking courses in such subjects as media studies, communication studies, or social linguistics, then the general feel of the new theoretical approaches to literature may well seem familiar. You will already be tuned in to the emphasis on ideas, which is one of their characteristics. You will be undaunted by their use of technical terminology and unsurprised by their strong social and political interests. If, on the other hand, you took a straight A-level literature or access course with a major emphasis on set books, then much of what is contained in this book will probably be new to you. Initially, you will have the problem of getting on the wavelength of these different ways of looking at literature. As you would expect in studying at degree level, you will encounter problems which do not have generally agreed solutions, and it is inevitable that your understanding of the matters discussed here will remain partial in both senses of that word, as everybody does. Para. But whichever of these two categories you fall into, I want to assure you at the outset that the doubts and uncertainties you will have about this material are probably not due to Para 1. Any supposed mental incapacity of your own, for example, to your not having a philosophical mind or not possessing the kind of X-ray intellect which can penetrate jargon and see the sense beneath, or two, the fact that your schooling did not include intensive tuition in, say, linguistics or philosophy, or 3, the innate and irreducible difficulty of the material itself, a point we will come back to. Rather, nearly all the difficulties you will have will be the direct result of the way theory is written and the way it is written about. For literary theory, it must be emphasized, is not innately difficult. There are very few inherently complex ideas in existence in literary theory, page 7. On the contrary, the whole body of work known collectively as theory is based upon some dozen or so ideas, none of which are in themselves difficult. Some of them are listed on pages 33-35. What is difficult, however, is the language of theory. Many of the major writers on theory are French, so that much of what we read is in translation, sometimes of a rather clumsy kind. Being a Romance language French text, most of its words directly from Latin, and it lacks the reassuring Anglo-Saxon layer of vocabulary which provides us with so many of our brief, familiar, everyday terms. Hence, a close English translation of a French academic text will contain a large number of longer Latinate words, always perceived as a source of difficulty by English-speaking readers. Writing with a high proportion of these characteristics can be off-putting and wearying, and it is easy to lose patience. But the frame of mind I would recommend at the outset is threefold. Firstly, we must have some initial patience with the difficult surface of the writing. We must avoid the too ready conclusion that literary theory is just meaningless, pretentious jargon, that is, that the theory is at fault, closed. Secondly, on the other hand, we must, for obvious reasons, resist the view that we ourselves are intellectually incapable of coping with it, that is, that we are at fault, closed. Thirdly, and crucially, we must not assume that the difficulty of theoretical writing is always the dress of profound ideas, only that it might sometimes be, which leaves the onus of discrimination on us. To sum up this attitude, we are looking in literary theory for something we can use, not something which will use us. We ought not to issue theory with a blank check to spend our time for us. If we do, it will certainly spend more than we can afford. Do not then be endlessly patient with theory. Require it to be clear and expect it in the longer term to deliver something solid. Don't be content, as many seem to be, just to see it as challenging conventional practice or putting it in question in some never quite specified way. Challenges are fine, but they have to amount to something in the end. Stop and think, reviewing your study of literature to date. Before we go on into what may well be a new stage in your involvement with literature, it would be sensible to take stock, page 8, and reflect a little on the nature of our literary education to date. The purpose of doing this is to begin the process of making visible and hence open to scrutiny the methods and procedures which have become so familiar to you, probably going back to the time when you began secondary school, closed, that they are no longer visible at all as a distinct intellectual practice. But stock-taking is not part of our normal intellectual routine, unfortunately, and it is a difficult and demanding thing to do. Yet, please do not skip this section, since theory will never make any sense to you until you feel the need for it yourself. What I would like you to do is to try to become conscious of the nature of your own previous work in English by recalling 1. What first made you decide to study English, what you hoped to gain from doing so, and whether that hope was realized? 2. Which books and authors were chosen for study and what they had in common? 3. Which books and authors now seem conspicuously absent? 4. What in general terms your previous study taught you, bracket, about life, say, or conduct, or about literature itself, bracket closed. Para. Doing this will help you to begin to obtain a perspective on your experience of literature to date. Spend an hour or so doing it. I carried out a similar exercise myself as part of the process of working on this book, and some of the result is given below. It is intended more as a prompt than a model, and I have not responded in any systematic way to the 4 questions above. Reproducing it will perhaps help to personalize the voice behind this book, but I leave you to decide whether you want to look at this before or after doing your own. Para. My own stock taking. Since literary theory is the topic of this book, I'll concentrate on detailing the course of my acquaintanceship with it. In fact, I heard nothing at all about literary theory as an undergraduate in London University in the late 1960s. I took a straightforward wolf to wolf quote WULF-2-WOOLF unquote page 9 English course bracket Beowulf to Virginia Woolf bracket closed with compulsory Old and Middle English papers. Essentially, I now realize the English course I followed in the late 1960s with compulsory Old and Middle English papers. Essentially, I now realize the English course I followed in the late 1960s retained the shape and the outlook of the pioneer English degree courses established at London University more than a century before. Para. The one innovation in English teaching at London was to recognize the existence of something called American literature and to appoint a lecturer to teach it. As a result of taking this American course, I became an enthusiast for a range of American poets who were part of the alternative culture of the time. At the same time, and for several years afterwards, I was also trying to write poetry of more or less this kind. It quickly became apparent that conventional criticism could make very little of poetry like this. So by the early 1970s, I was beginning to look at newer critical approaches than those I had encountered at university. But I wasn't at that time an advocate of literary theory, since theory as such was then a non-existent category in literary studies. Para. The change of emphasis seems to have happened in my own case around 1973, when the words structuralism and semiotics began to feature in notes about what I was reading and in the titles of the books and articles I was interested in. Structuralism, we were then learning, was a new kind of literary theory which had recently become prominent in France, and semiotics, the science of signs, was one of its sub-branches. I was loosely connected with the London Graduate Seminar started by Frank Kermode, Kermode, after he became Professor of English at University College London. The group debated the work at the structuralist Roland Barthes, Barthes, and caught Kermode's enthusiasm for it. I bought and read everything by Barthes, then in print in England, no great undertaking, since all that was available was, quote, writing degree 0, unquote, and, quote, elements of semiology, unquote, probably his least interesting and least accessible books. His much more engaging collection, Mythologies, appeared in English in 1973 in the Paladin imprint. 1973 was also the year when the Times Literary Supplement devoted the major part of 2 issues, 5 and 12 October, to a, quote, survey of semiotics, unquote, with articles by Umberto Eco, Taviton, Todorov, and page 10, Julia Kristeva, major names in these new kinds of critical theory, and encountered then, within bracket in my case, for the first time. This interest in theory was consolidated in 1981 when I was asked to devise a course on literary theory as part of the BA program at my previous college, and in turn a decade or so of teaching that course has led to this book.